everybody, Mike here, and welcome to the podcast, coming at you from suburban Columbus, Ohio, where in accordance with my promise to not complain about the weather, I'm not going to complain that today is 36 degrees and snowing on April freaking 15th. I'm not going to complain about that. It's actually the 16th. I'm not going to complain about that. I'm not going to complain about the fact that it was 80 degrees for a couple of days here last week and that now it's in the mid 30s and snowing. I'm just not going to complain about it. So, how are you? I hope you're well wherever you are. Thank you as always for tuning in. And thank you for allowing us to be a part of your lives as always. We're so very grateful for the people who like and subscribe, who rate us, who give us feedback. Thank you for new Patreon supporters. And I mean, we're just incredibly grateful for the opportunity to do this week in and week out. Last week, we, meaning me, talked a bit about narcissism, and I did it from the perspective of a friend that I have who struggles with it. And so I talked about him a lot and got some feedback. So if you're just tuning into this episode, I would highly encourage you to listen to the one before this one, where we kind of talk a bit about what narcissism is, what causes it, what to look for. Most of us know it when we see it, but it's good to have a little background on it. Today we want to continue that conversation, but before we dive in, I got some comments, loads of comments on this one, but there were a few I wanted to recognize. First of all, young man writes in, "Hello, I just listened to your podcast regarding narcissism, and it quickly became apparent that you were describing my thoughts and habits." Now, see that exactly. Only a narcissist would hear someone else's thoughts on narcissism and assume that they apply to them, which is perfect. Or, my friend, I can just simply say I had you in mind all along. Either way, you briefly mentioned at the end of the podcast that one avenue of growth has been recognizing the magnitude of your sin, and identifying as the biggest sinner in the room. This is very helpful. Are there any other tools that you found useful for those of us having narcissistic tendencies? Are there any authors, teachers that you found useful in this area? Regards. Absolutely. I hope at the end of this episode, I'll get into some other things I've learned the hard way. And yes, there have been people who, and books that have been amazingly helpful. So hopefully we get into all of that. But if you've never read a guy named Dallas Willard, he wrote Hearing God, The Spirit of the Disciplines, The Divine Conspiracy. Those are just immensely helpful books for me. He wrote one after those called Renovation of the Heart, which is kind of an extrapolation of the Spirit of the Disciplines, but the whole understanding of spiritual disciplines has been really, really helpful. So off the top of my head, and I'm sure there are other very clinical or more psychological books, those are just general books that have changed the way I view Jesus and have changed the way I understand spiritual formation. I would also encourage you to look up a guy named John Coe, C-O-E. He is at the Talbot's Institute of Spiritual Formation, a mentor of mine from years back who's got some amazing stuff on spiritual formation and how that works. So I would encourage you to check those things out. And then hopefully, again, at the end of this episode, we'll get to some practical other practices, and I'd love any thoughts that you have as well. Another email. Holy cow. Hey, Mike, holy cow. I'm a clinical psychologist. The podcast on narcissism was spot on and so honest and real. I think it was helpful to a lot who struggle with this wound and its defenses. Thank you for being so vulnerable and putting it all out there. Thank you so much. The ego that has been deprived appreciates that kind of feedback. And no, actually, to hear from a psychologist that we were close to being accurate is always a great thing. So thank you for your feedback. I'm very, very glad that we were congruent with kind of what's the psychological understanding that's out there of this. And then my friend Aline on our Facebook community group page asked this one: is there a sliding scale for narcissism? I'm asking for a friend. Now that's awesome. And she's got some more, but let me deal with this really quickly. It seems like there is, and in other words, it seems like there are elements that of what we would classically understand as narcissism that are absolutely necessary to be a normal kind of functioning person in the world. So I don't think that, on the one hand, the desire to feel significant, I mean, I think that is part of our imago Dei, right? It's part of our image bearing, the desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. I think that's a good thing. But I think that can be warped and twisted in a way that you begin to get life, and you begin to demand, and you begin to feel entitled, and you begin to prop up a false self around the idea of feeling important and feeling a part of something bigger. And that's where it crosses the line. So I think there are some things we talked about in that last time on that long, big list that are actually things that elements of which are needed to be a healthy, functioning adult in the world. So yes, there does seem to be like it's a sliding scale. Hopefully, over the course of the last 10 years, I've grown less to be this way. Although certain parts, seem to be core elements of my personality. I fully believe in the power of Jesus, the disciplines and the community to bring transformation. I also think that to a certain degree, the desire for attention, the desire for significance, some of those things aren't necessarily bad. So absolutely, it seems like there's a spectrum. Then you wrote, onto that note, I wanted to thank you again for putting yourself out there. You're welcome. I was thinking about what the opposite of narcissism is, being humble, right? And she says, I read a couple of verses on being humble, Philippians 2, 1 Peter 5, James 4, Matthew 11. I love that. I love that. And I was thinking, she said, about your example of being in the group study where you find it really hard not to interject. I get, she says, you not wanting to be a braggadocious person about all the churches you've been a part of and the books you've written. Oh, yes. But I also think that maybe you need to consider interjecting into the group. I mean, what a bummer to be in a study group with Mike and not get to hear what God has spoken to your heart and your mind. The opposite of narcissism can't be silence. Discernment is necessary in managing both narcissism and modesty. Anyway, lots more to say on this topic, mostly because my friend felt a little bit convicted, and I figured I would mention this much. I absolutely cannot agree more with your question. And I really don't know. I mean, I need to think about that. I have not, yes, of course, humility, but I think there are lots of false understandings about what humility is and is not. There does seem to be this aspect of self-denial that isn't denying self as much as it is self-denial, which I view as an entirely different thing. I am a self. I have a personality. I'm an individual. God loves me. So I'm not denying that I am a self. But self-denial seems like an incredibly important, different idea than denial of self. So on the one hand, denial of self could easily be say like, when you do something well, you never take credit for it. No, dude, it was all God. And it's like, nah, God really designed the world to have human participants a part of his work. And so it's okay to accept some thank yous and affirmations and encouragements. But self-denial seems to be a different sort of thing where you're consistently putting the needs of others ahead of your own. If that's what we mean by humility, then yes, that seems like the opposite of narcissism. It's exactly what Paul writes in the passage you mentioned, Philippians chapter 2, where Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but rather he made himself nothing, taking on the very form of a servant. That exactly is the opposite of narcissism. So you're right in the sense that just sitting there and not, I mean, because health isn't just never speaking because I'm afraid of doing it from wrong motives, or never preaching because I'm afraid I could be doing it from wrong motives. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. That in that sense, it's not the opposite of silence, but silence and obscurity, I do think, play important roles in the art of learning self-denial, so that I think there are times when, even though I want to interject and think, oh my goodness, the world would be so much more better off if people were to pay attention to my words right now. I think there is a beautiful practice of just remaining silent. Now I don't think you be silent just for the sake of being silent. I think you be silent for the sake of becoming healthy. And health for me would look like sitting in a room and not being aware of how I'm being perceived, or being worried about how I'm being perceived, but instead would just naturally have enough emotional intelligence and spiritual discernment to watch an ebb and flow of conversation, to know or get a sense of when I should be contributing and when I should be silent. At this point, I don't have a modulating switch. I'm kind of all or nothing, and so part of a discipline for me is the discipline of obscurity, right? It's and even doing a podcast, if we're not careful, can be a exercise in narcissism, right? Because here I am in a room by myself, talking about very important things, responding to people's questions, setting myself up as some very important voice. And so one of the reasons why I did last week and felt like I really needed to share honestly, there were two reasons. One, that's part of my attempt to dismantle the false self that I'm tempted to create. But then secondly, if we're going to critique the church on some points like we are today, then I want to make sure that I've dealt with the log in my own eye before I point out the speck of dust in others. So, fantastic thoughts. Thank you for your feedback. And there was a lot more than that, but those I thought each brought out really good points, particularly the one that complimented me. Now, it's incredibly important to understand that these sorts of issues are nothing new. Now, we may have better diagnostic tools, and we may have better labels, but this kind of stuff goes all the way back, into the Old Testament. Certainly in the New Testament church. I mean, John, in 3 John, a really popular book, 3 John, John writes to a church leader. He says this. He says, "I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words. And not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brethren either, and he forbids those who desire to do so and puts them out of the church." So this is some sort of church leader that is not submitting to John's authority. And here's how he describes him. I wrote something in the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. Now that in a one-word descriptor is the summation of narcissism right there. And so obviously this was something that the New Testament church was dealing with. I mean, there were conflicts over different human personalities in the Corinthian church. And so we want to recognize that narcissists are attracted to professions where they get a lot of recognition and they get a lot of favor. They're held in high regard. And vocational Christian church ministry is one of the most appealing, I think, professions for those of us of this persuasion, because of the unique combination between attention and high regard. In other words, there is uniquely in church ministry the opportunity to become celebrity in ways that don't require you to be talented in movies or music or arts. And so I really think there is something wrong in the way Americans understand church and leadership and like senior leadership. That I think makes pastoral work, because the question has to be asked, okay, so why are there so many celebrity pastors, and why are so many of these celebrity pastors having moral failures? And I understand moral failures completely. I get them. I've had my own. I totally understand what it means to not be perfect in senior leadership. But it seems like there are these high profile things that keep coming down social media at us about different platforms and people who built them and things that happen and those platforms go away. So I wanted to ask the question, what is it about the way Americans, and not all of them, but my tribe of American evangelicals, what is it about our understandings of church and ministry and leadership that cause narcissists to gravitate to some of those roles? And certainly, please hear, not everybody who is in a megachurch role or has a large platform is a narcissist, right? I think of a guy like Dallas Willard. I just read his biography, and it's phenomenal. If you're a fan of his, you absolutely need to read it. But this guy never sought a platform. He never had a speaking contract. He never had a set fee to speak. He never submitted a book proposal. I mean, he was approached for all of these things. And there's a guy who had a huge platform, or a guy like Eugene Peterson, huge platform. Or somebody like Beth Moore. I mean, I follow her on Twitter, and she is amazing. Here's somebody that these are people that are trustworthy with their platforms precisely because they never sought to have one. And so it's in no way, shape, or form am I denigrating the fact that God gives platforms to people. And sometimes, as we see in the scriptures, God will use very, very flawed people to do incredible work through. So hallelujah for that. But I do think there are unique and sometimes tragic ideas buried into Western American evangelicalism in terms of how we understand leadership in church and so on and so on, that give rise to pastoral abuses in terms of power, in terms of sexuality and its failings. I mean, I just think there are unique things that need to be pointed out. So this is going to be a bit scattershot, but been thinking a lot about it. And one of the great tragedies, I think, in American church culture is the fact that, and I know it's being resisted more these days now than ever in my short lifetime, but the church is primarily a place where a weekly event is held, and that event exalts one or two gifts over the rest of the gifts in the body of Christ. It's usually an event, it's some sort of worship teaching event, but even calling it worship denigrates it because we just associate worship with singing. So you have a really gifted song leader and you have a really gifted speaker, and those are the gifts that are primarily put on display. Yes, of course, you need admins and shepherds and people with the gift of mercy, but those aren't the gifts that everyone kind of notices or talks about or that the church is built upon. The church is really built upon the speaking gift and the musical gifts of several people. And so anytime you're exalting one sort of gift publicly over others, I mean, Paul, evidently this was something happening in the Corinthian church, because Paul writes 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 about the administration of spiritual gifts, and particularly how about those people who are gifted in ways that aren't obvious and they don't get special honor, they're worthy of it. Precisely because they're not public, and because God has given very important things to do with people that you'd never see or never notice. And so we've reduced church. Now, again, there's this whole big swing against this, but no matter how much we're swinging, there's still a remnant, a residue of this sort of Christian cultural understanding that church is a place where there is an event on the weekend or some other time where I sit in a seat and I, yes, participate, but primarily consume. I evaluate churches the way I would evaluate movies, asking, did I like it? Was it good? I assume that just like businesses, bigger is always better. So small churches can't be that great because they're small, and just in virtue of their being small. If they were great, they would grow. And so that we kind of load into the church this cultural assumption that bigger equals better. So if it's big, it must be important. If it's big, it must be successful. If it's big, it must be blessed by God. And in these environments, the idea of a brand or the idea of self-promotion, building a platform, all of that's totally acceptable in Christian circles. And again, I'm not saying it's all bad. Obviously, I podcast. Obviously, I'm on Twitter. I have a very small platform, but a platform nevertheless. And there's always a part of me that has wanted one that is larger. Absolutely. The issue, though, comes in when self-promotion gets Christianized. And again, I don't mean, I mean promotion of the self. Now, obviously, letting people know ministry things that are happening, letting people know, you've written a book. I mean, I get all of that, and I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about self-promotion in that way. I'm talking about promotion of the self, that social media now is a way in which my false self can be continually propped up, continually blessed, continually liked, continually retweeted, and I don't have to do the hard work of community or confession or even being known in order to receive ego gratification by simply tweeting out something very incredibly witty or something very smart or whatever it is. And so social media has enabled self-promotion in ways that we can't help but try to Christianize. And again, some of this is just fine. I totally understand. But there is a sense that the temptation towards narcissism is just made all the much greater by the fact that the opportunities for self-promotion are proliferating. And Francis Chan is somebody who I have unbelievable respect for. Here's somebody who had a massive platform. He wrote a book that just went nuts. He took every cent of the money he received from that book and gave it away. Created a foundation, gave it away. Left the mega church because he was dissatisfied with that model, and now plants little house churches, I believe still in San Francisco, although it's been a couple years since I've heard, which is exactly the point. Francis goes to conferences, he shares a lot what he's doing, but here's a guy that never intended on building a platform, though God has given him one. But he certainly is not somebody that promotes self. If anything, he goes to the opposite of that in a very, very extreme way. So there are people, I think, that are out there that are really able to handle a large platform. But as we see in the scriptures, God will sometimes he'll give success beyond what someone's character can handle. And so I think that our understanding of church and certainly the way that understanding is practiced gets at least called into question. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to go to a church, because I love to pastor these churches and be a part of these churches where there is a big gathering and there is somebody who gets up and is gifted teaching and somebody who gets up and who's gifted in worship leading. My point in bringing that up is to simply say that I think both the congregation and the leadership have to be aware of the unconscious collusion that happens between meeting the the folks that are on stage by meeting their ego needs. I'm not saying, of course it's nice to be liked. Of course it's nice to have influence. I'm not saying any of that is bad. I'm just saying the really subtle collusion that can begin to exist between people who want to be a part of something important. And here's this kind of rock star celebrity pastor in church. Francis has this great line. He's like, if you're ever in a church and you hear the name of the pastor more than you hear the name of Jesus, you really need to be worried. And I'm paraphrasing him, but I always thought that was a really remarkable and insightful statement, because even in the first century, people were arguing about personalities, right? Paul has to deal with this in 1 Corinthians, where he's dealing with people who are like, I follow Paul, and I follow Cephas, who's Peter, I follow Apollos. And they're getting to these, so it's not just on the leadership side, it lies the heart of narcissism, but even on the follower side, right? I mean, we even name them followers or congregants. I mean, there's this sense in which we're always looking for people to follow and identify with and to kind of give credibility to. And so both directions of this have to be addressed and at least acknowledged in a really healthy environment. So I'm around lots of big megachurch pastors, some of whom are incredible and handle this well. Some of whom you can just tell they reek of self-promotion. They reek of platform building. They never show weakness. They never show themselves in any unattractive way. They never, anything they reveal about themselves is always humorous. Oh, isn't that sweet? Here's a cute story about my kids. It's never just ugly. It's never just visceral. It's never just raw. It's never just something that could possibly turn somebody off. And I just think that's toxic. And for those of us participating in part of the platform of those people, I think we have a responsibility to remove allegiance to leaders who are clearly about building a platform. And you can say, hey, it's all about Jesus, but if it's all about you, even when you say it's all about Jesus, doesn't matter whether you say it's about him or not. It's really about you. So I think there's this big discernment that we have to get to that flows from a changing definition of what church is. Church is, of course, a people, not a place, not a program. Church, of course, is a people that are characterized by God dwelling among them. That is the primary characteristic of God's people, is God dwells among them. And so they're both holy and unholy. They're people in process. They're people covered by covenant because they cannot approach the righteousness and holiness of God by themselves through their own merits. These are people that should be unbelievably in touch with grace, not only for themselves but for others. These are people who diligently want to see God's purposes at work in the world, and who, when healthy, will not care who gets the credit for that, as long as what God is after is actually happening. And so when you start looking at church that way, well, then you kind of get to different forms. And even though you may have a once a week sort of big gathering with a stage, you recognize you have to have smaller groups. You have to have other places where gifts are being developed. And so the nature of what we understand church to be, of course, has to be very, very carefully rethought, so that even when we're in scenarios where there's kind of one primary voice, one primary leader, one primary personality, we're not giving that individual undue allegiance and loyalty, that there's this sense that this thing is really about Jesus. So our current understandings and definitions of church make this attractive to people who are narcissistic in one way or another. The nature and definition we have in my tribe anyway of leadership is also I think very, very narrow and very difficult. So we are watching a generation of baby boomer pastors who have built big churches. They've built buildings. They've built big congregations. They've written big books. I mean, and they're now starting to transition out of those positions and then transition people who are new into those positions. But a lot of these folks have either reflected on leadership or quoted other leadership gurus or practiced a kind of leadership that does seem to be very narrow. It's like type A, I'm out front, I'm a visionary, I'm a CEO. And certainly there are people that God gives those gifts to. Absolutely. My objection is that is kind of the only understanding we have of leadership, that there aren't bigger and more understandings of leadership, so that senior pastors can exist in worlds where they don't have the gift of leadership, but leadership is still expressed by people who have it, or leadership is expressed through a cooperative and mutually sacrificing people. That leadership becomes not just this very narrow entrepreneurial take the hill, because that's my kind of leadership. I mean, I naturally gravitate to type A, out front, visionary CEO, of course, but that also gets me in a ton of trouble, because I can easily isolate, I can easily believe the hype, I can easily think that I've got it figured out and I know all the answers, and everyone is just waiting to get enlightened for whatever idea I'm going to bring. And that's just toxic. That is absolutely brutal. And I think really resists the spirit of God at work in the churches through other people. And so for me, if as long as we are going to narrowly define leadership, then I think we're going to keep attracting folks for whom that kind of leadership might come very naturally, but that kind of leadership also is very attractive for the kinds of perks it gives. In other words, if you're always out front, then you can get life from always having to be out front, get significance, get importance from always having to be the one out front, or you're the visionary, or you're the type A and you've got to develop everybody else, and can't really learn anything from anybody under you. You're somebody that needs a hierarchy. I mean, there are all these sorts of things built into our assumptions about leadership that at least need to be examined and called into question in the way that they're practiced and understood by the scriptures. Because obviously Jesus presents a very different picture of leadership. Although Jesus was clearly the focus of attention, clearly the teacher who was teaching, clearly the one whom ministry revolved, yet he was able to define leadership as servanthood. And we'll all of us will say, of course, leadership is servanthood. But I tell you the truth, in my heart, there becomes a place where, because I need to feel special or entitled, yes, of course I serve, but I serve by leading, and I serve by teaching, and I serve by, having kind of unique perks that go with the role or the pressures of the role or whatever. So even those sorts of understandings can be abused if we're not careful. And again, man, I'm not indicting anyone or any form. This is speaking autobiographically. I just think that our imaginations are way too narrow when it comes to the forms of church, so that if you're a narcissist, you might gravitate to those. Oh, there's Seth Erre. Seth Erre's home from school, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, Seth Erre.
Hi.
Okay, say, hello, Internet.
Hi, Nat.
Say, it's Mike and Seth.
Mike and Seth.
And we're here in Ohio.
Hello.
How was school today?
It's good.
Was it good today?
Yeah.
Can you give your daddy kisses? Okay, that was blowing a kiss to the microphone. How about your dad? Give him kisses.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, buddy. All right, can I keep going?
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for saying hi, Sethy. Love you, boy. I think the floppy is on the kitchen table. Or do I have it? No, I have it. I have the floppy. Oh, okay. If you don't know what the floppy is, our little dude Seth loves the combination. So I'm looking at a floppy in my hand right now that is a comb, and it's got like a lanyard, a little cloth sort of knit necklace that clips onto the comb. So the comb is firm, but when you flop it around, there's this little floppy part to it. That is the floppy, and that is simply the most important part of Seth Erre's life. If asked to choose between the floppy and his parents, he may go floppy. I'm not quite sure. But so his first question when he comes home from school, because he can't have it at school, is where is the floppy? So anyway, Seth Erre, questions about how narrowly we define the idea of leadership, and is it possible to become somebody secure enough in your own giftedness that other people who have different elements of gifts of leadership are welcome at the table? And then lastly, and this one's long, so I don't know. I may have to wait till what we do. See you, big boy. Thank you for blowing kisses. May have to wait till next podcast because we're already 33 minutes. By the way, I hope this is helpful. I hope it's coming across well, because last thing I want to do is just sit here and be critical. I just think, man, we have to discern, and because we haven't done a great job, I think, discerning always about the people we give platforms to. I also think the nature of the role, so the nature of church, how we understand it, the nature of leadership, and then the nature of the role of kind of senior pastor, lead teacher, kind of lends itself to this sort of celebrityism. The stage is absolutely toxic because somebody who wants attention, where are you most at home? Most at home on the stage, baby. And it took a long time for me to get to the point where I could go up and teach on a big stage, but not be defined completely by how I did. My wife always makes fun of me because I would walk down, immediately say, "Hey, how was that?" Because that for me was the most important thing, right? It wasn't, I really hope that blessed people. It was, hey, was that good? I don't want to suck. So the nature of the stage is toxic because think about what's going on there. People are clapping, people are affirming you. They send you emails and encouragement that God has used you to change their life or to bless them or convict them. And hallelujah, those things are so kind and nice and encouraging, and they are needed for a lot of us, absolutely. But you also have up there, you have power, control, and influence. Right? In the sense of you have people there who are sitting listening to you. And for a lot of church services, there's a great deal of control exercised. Because we don't want to be unpolished, and the desire to influence. Obviously, you get into vocational ministry to be a blessing to other people, but that can quickly turn into meeting my own ego needs to feel significant and important. So one author, I loves this. They call the church, if we're not careful, they call the big church kind of the applause machine. And that just means that it's very, very tempting to prop up the false self when we're up there teaching and we're up there leading worship. Because on the one hand, our ego needs are being met. Here I am. I'm the center of 1,800 people are watching me right now, or 7,000 or whatever it is. And they're tuning in online and so on, so on, so on. And what I have to say is really, really important, and often it is. But there is a sense in which, if we're not careful, that then becomes a way of propping up the false self, and our hidden self, our real self, we can never let out because we built a whole platform, we've built a whole church on the false self, we've built these expectations into people, and now we have financial motivation to keep the false self going, because if people were really going to know how sick and dark our hearts really were, well, then they wouldn't support us anymore. And so there is this big edifice that comes along with being super gifted, because now instead of being a servant of all, or now being able to walk well in weakness, now you've got to live under and for the expectations of other people, and that is a heavy load to live with. So the concept of celebrity pastors. And if you want to hear more about this idea of celebrity pastors, a guy named Sky Jithani, he's a friend of the podcast, a personal acquaintance and friend. He and I went to college together and then have reconnected the last couple of years. He has something on YouTube about why are there so many celebrity pastors. And he gets into something that he calls it the EIC, the evangelical industrial complex. This is a reference back to the military industrial complex, when with the rise of governmental agencies that would contract out to defense contractors, you had now a financial incentive to keep millions of people employed and lots of money to be made. You had a financial incentive to stay at war, or at least to threaten. And in the same way, Sky rightly points out there is a huge financial incentive in terms of finding the next big celebrity pastor, and that role, that incentive really is formed around three elements. The EIC, the evangelical industrial complex, is formed around three elements, and again, he does a much better job kind of identifying this, but he asks just such great questions. He says, first, the evangelical industrial complex is really built around three components: the megachurch, the Christian publishing industry, and the publication of books. The megachurch, the publication of books, and the Christian conference circuit. And this was new when I published. So the first book I published was a book named Jesus of Suburbia, and I published that in 2006 maybe. I don't exactly remember. And I had an agent, and I had been approached to do this, and so I was like, hey, this is really cool. The book sold well, at least for a first book in the Christian market. And I remember this was like, I was attending loads of conferences. We had these youth specialties conferences, and there were leadership conferences, and this was before the big Catalyst conferences and stuff. And I remembered such disappointment upon hearing that my favorite conferences, the people they booked to speak were all people that had books with the publishing company. In other words, there was a publishing company who sponsored a conference. All right. And they weren't shy about letting people know they sponsored this conference. I just didn't put it all together. But because they sponsored the conference, the speakers that they selected to put on stage were all speakers who had books with that publisher. So because I didn't have a book with that publisher, I'd never be highlighted. And that the books, the people chosen to write books were all people that had large churches. So the evangelical industrial complex takes megachurch pastors, because they have large platforms, introduces them to the publishing world, even if they have good or bad ideas, but because they have large platforms, then we can sell a lot of books, throws in conferences and conference invites that now are made to those who have books to promote or content to promote, which further feeds into their megachurch brand. And so there's this kind of cyclical thing that's happening. And there is a lot of money involved in Christian publishing. Now, that doesn't mean all Christian publishers are bad or all conferences are bad, but there was even one huge conference. I was kind of on the ground floor of a planning meeting, and literally the success of the conference was determined by how much, quote, product was sold. Not the attendees to the conference, but how many books, tapes, whatever, were sold as to the attendees because of the platforms of the people who were speaking. And you just realize, okay, there are really good people in the Christian publishing world. There are really good people in the megachurch world. There are really good people in the conference world. And I'm not in any way saying that that's not true. There are really good people. But I've also seen, heard, and experienced some things where it does feel like, and Sky points this out beautifully, that the only qualification, it seems, or at least it used to be, I hope maybe it's less true now, the only qualification seems to be how influential or how big the platform is. And so it doesn't, so for instance, and Sky does a great job with this. He says, how do we know that people who write marriage books have good marriages? Like, who checks that? Or people that are giving, writing books on sexuality, are healthy in their sexuality. Or people that are writing books on, being gracious in leadership are actually gracious in leadership and not just self-serving jerks. How do we know? Like, who's arbitrating that? Is it the churches of these megachurch pastors or the elder boards? It turns out to be the editors of the publishing houses. And so if you have a big enough platform and a marketable enough idea, well, then often you get a book deal, regardless of whether or not the book will be any good. It just matters, can it sell? And so Sky, I would encourage you to check it out. Sky just, talks about these sorts of things. Because there is an industry propping up, and it does have a vested interest in Christian celebrities. If we're not careful, that's why you're never seeing somebody on stage who pastors a church of 30. Right? They're always the big pastors. They're always and sometimes they're the best people for the job. Sometimes the people with the biggest platforms are the people who have the most important things to say. I just want to throw out the idea that that's not always true. But who discerns this? How do we recognize this? So, in answer to the question, hey, what is it about ministry that attracts people who have narcissistic tendencies? Well, certainly in my tribe, the way we define church, the way we define leadership, the way we define kind of what it is to be a senior pastor, certainly is appealing because it provides all the stuff our false self would want. Now, I think we're going to have to wait till next podcast to talk about how do we war against that. So I'll leave it now. We're at 43 minutes. Most of you have fallen asleep. And not that I blame you at all, but next podcast we'll cover unless, we're at war with Syria now that we've launched missiles or something. Next podcast, if nothing horrible happens between now and then, we'll talk about what do we do? What do we do corporately? What do you do if you're a person who's at a church that you think, this person's narcissistic? What do you do if you're a person like our friend who asked early, hey, how do I work on this? Really got some thoughts, and I hope they're helpful. So, my brothers and sisters, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you. May it stop snowing. And may our Lord give you peace in these days. Till next time, brothers and sisters, thanks so much for tuning in.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Vox Podcast. Learn more about us at voxpodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter at the Vox Podcast, and now support us on Patreon at patreon.com/voxpodcast.